right, thanks for turning us into geeks today. It feels a bit weird in a place of experiment and food. Let's be geeks. So thanks, Brian, for joining us from Saskatoon and Blair from Vermont. We'll pick up from where the other conversation left. We have here two bakers who have been experimenting a lot with those varieties and those flours that change day to day, month to month, year to year. And would you like to introduce where you come from? What's your bakery setup? Just maybe in a few seconds, and then Blair too. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bryn Rollick. I own the Night Oven Bakery. We've been open for just over 5 years, and we mill all of our own flour. We mill all of our whole grain flour, so we also source organic white sifted flour, and we use a variety of different kinds. And I also, in October, opened a trendy donut shop with the goal of also using flour there. So that's what I do. Wood-fired also, I guess. Yeah.
Cool. So my name is Blair Marvin. I own a wood-fired bakery in northern Vermont, Elmore, Vermont, about 2 hours south of here. I also co-own New American Stone Mills with my husband. We've been baking sourdough breads in our wood-fired oven for 15 years. And about 6 years ago, we became a little stagnant. Just a quick reason, I guess, why I ended up here today. 6 years ago, kind of getting a little bored in our, not bored, but stagnant and understimulated, needed something new. There was a convalescence of a couple things. I had a new son who was just starting to eat a tremendous amount of food, and 99% of what he wanted to eat was baguettes. So, as a new mom, I wanted to have the healthiest food possible for my son, and so naturally I wanted to figure out how to improve my breads. Second, I was exposed to a box of fresh stone-milled flour from a fellow baker and miller in North Carolina. Basically blew my mind. I had never experienced the aroma of flour like that. That also sent me on a trajectory, and to kind of tie it into what was before, part of my interest, my stagnation as a baker was feeling a disconnect with my primary product. And I felt the need and the desire to create a conversation and to get to meet the people that was growing my grains. I didn't understand why they were performing that way. I didn't understand why this box of flour had such an intense aroma. I didn't understand why I was having troubles with flour or successes. And so I wanted to be able to make healthier bread for my son. I wanted to be stimulated as a baker. I wanted to use fermentation to enhance these aromas and inherent flavors of the grains that I had been exposed to. And I also wanted to get to know the farmers and have a deeper personal understanding of my primary ingredient. And so...
So here we're done with the why, Mark.
Yes.
Okay. Well, or maybe Bryn can tell us a bit, why did you buy into fresh flour? What was the buy-in for you as a baker?
I built my first oven actually in La Parc-Saint-Nom, just underneath up at the north of Saint-Laurent there. And then kind of that sparked for me the excitement around the process of baking. So my staff kind of roll their eyes now at me, but I truly think that making bread is magic. We take something that is inedible, and you could chew grain, I guess, but it's not very fun for our teeth and yada yada. But then through hands and process, we create something that is delicious and wonderful. And it's every time I work a shift and pull bread out of the oven, I'm like, yeah, this is great. So then I was then in Turin at the Terra Madre Slow Food Convention, and I was sitting around with all these bakers from around the world that had sort of gathered to just kind of talk about bread issues. And every single one of them was like, oh, I want to connect more with grain. I want more, exactly the same issues that Blair's mentioning. I want more of a, relation with be able to explain to my customers where, 80%, where all of the flour is coming from. And I was sitting there thinking, the city, Saskatoon is a city of 250,000 people. If I ride my bike from any point in the city for 45 minutes in any direction, I'll end up in a wheat field. So like we're just surrounded by, I know, you know, everybody in Saskatchewan has some direct relation with farmers, but there's still in my city a disconnect. People are like, oh yeah, I know farmers and the weather affects farmers, but they don't, even farmers don't think about the diversity of flavor and within the grain. So one of the organic farmers that I was talking to, they said, they were like, oh yeah, grain would taste different. And they didn't think about that baker's perspective. So the Night Oven is a project to help. I got into it to share that excitement and flavor. Flavor, yes, but like that story of, you know, there's people who are actually growing grain. That grain is made into bread and you can eat it and enjoy it. This is the whole picture of it. And so whole grain flour and milling it is part of that story. Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
We're curious to know here how many bakers there are in here or millers who are into using grain fresh and turning them into flour and bread. Raise your hand. And how many of you are still trying to figure out how to do it and come up with something interesting that works out for you? Is the challenge truly like technical, or it's based on the business model of having such an operation? So who's into like the technical difficulties and troubleshooting here? Raise your hand. And who's into like trying to figure out how to build it into your business model? Okay, so we have a little more business model issues here than we have like technical aspects, and so we'll try to focus on both of them. So let's start with a business model sort of question. How did you figure out how you would have a successful bakery working from the grain to the flour and to the bread? Because you two bakers actually work the whole thing, right? So can you tell us a bit about like how do you set up a business, you know, to do that?
Yeah, so we had been baking for many, many years prior to using fresh stone ground flour. And so we had built our breads with a certain aesthetic and profile, and our customers, we live in a very small town. I think during the winter there's like 600 people. And so it's a very low population area. And so I really have to be super conscious about what my demographic expects and how they perceived our bread. And I didn't want to, I knew that I wanted to be using fresh stone ground flour and Vermont grown flour, but I wanted to be able, I didn't want to alienate my customers to suddenly start taking these white flour baguettes and turning it upside down and making 100% whole grain bread and alienating these loyal customers that I had cultivated and worked for so many years. And in our area in Vermont at the time, and we didn't have a small scale stone milling operation. And so the only choice for us to be able to work with local farmers and to use stone ground flour at that point was to do it ourselves. So my husband set out to build a stone mill that would be able to mill flour that would allow us to have the flavor and nutrition of the fresh stone ground flour, but would also allow us to create breads that had the same aesthetic that our customer base was used to. So I was trying to maintain that business, that success I had found in years prior. And so by building a mill that allowed us to do that, we were able to kind of slowly introduce the fresh milled grains into our products. Though that being said, like my favorite story ever is one day on the bench. The bread we make boast of is our country bread. It's 100% sourdough bread. It's our staple. It's our favorite. And one day on the bench, it felt totally different. And I was like, what's up with this? And then our plan was to incorporate this stone ground flour slowly in small percentages. And Andrew, my husband, in classic fashion, just didn't tell me and put 100% fresh milled flour in there. And I was like the biggest disaster and the greatest success that I had ever experienced. And what I knew from that moment on is that we couldn't go backwards. We needed to be using all fresh milled flour and to be able to really look at our doughs and assess how we needed to adjust our fermentation schedule our starter percentage, and kind of flip everything upside down in the bakery. But that's what we were looking for, and that's part of the challenge of working with this fresh milled grain. So.
When we're talking freshly milled, means it has to be milled on location. So, Bryn, building a
Yes and
mill,
no.
yes and no.
Yes and
okay,
no.
so we'll see the yes with Bryn, and I'll see the no with you. So the yes, you build your own mill. To answer the call of like milling your flour fresh, how did you came up with that equation, and why didn't you choose to have it milled outside of your working place?
Yeah, so I'm one, I get very, very excited about projects, it seems, is something I've realized about myself, is I like, creating projects and doing things. And so I was at Terra Madra and talked to those people, went back to Saskatoon, and I have worked as a baker in a variety of places before that, and then realized that the bakery, if there was a bakery in my city that was doing that, I probably would have just worked there and provided energy towards that project, but there wasn't, so I was like, okay, well, I should build my own bakery. I went and staged with Cliff Lear in Victoria, British Columbia, a friend of mine who has Folle Pay Bakery and Wildfire previous to that, where he has essentially done this exact same thing of building an oven and building a mill, kind of one of the first people around that did that in North America. And he's a guy that says, yeah, you just, put some stones together and, attach a motor and, it's no big deal. And then you're like, oh, well, can you tell me a bit more about that? And he's like, yeah, I have notes somewhere. I don't know where they are. And and he's a interesting fellow in himself. So then I went back and I had a talk with my wife and was like, okay, this is what I want to do. And this is, and she said, well, it sounds like you just want to build a mill and build a wood-fired oven. What's the business? And I was like, right, okay, so I have to come up with that. At the time, again, there was no store, there was no New American Stone mill, so there was no place to buy. I guess you could
Probably imported from France.
Import an Osterroller and that I had, that's a whole nother conversation. And so my wife was like, well, where are you going to get a mill? And I was like, well, I'm going to have to build one. And then financing is challenging because banks don't want to give you money if it's not something that they can resell if you go under. And so the question was, why
would you
business,
build
why would I
it?
do it into my business?
Yeah.
And so you need a mill. And so to be able to share whole grain flour. And so I built a mill, and I also had a small 8-inch Meadows mill that we used, which I would not recommend to anyone in this room. And
is there someone using a Meadows mills?
the larger ones can be okay, but the smaller ones are not, in my opinion.
Well, if you want to make moonshine, at
Yes,
the
yeah,
back
they're
of
good
your
for,
field with some
like, a
maize,
grist mill,
non-GMO, then that's
Yeah.
what it was built for.
Yes, not for bread flour. And so then that was part of that story.
Right.
And so my whole business is, we're wood-fired bread, stone milled flour, wood-fired bread, and that's what we do. And so having a mill there was essential to that,
I'm interested in building mills because I've seen both of your mills, and they're like 4-foot stones, and now maybe you're using a larger one. That's a technical question. How would you go on choosing the size of the mill that you'll set up on your floor when you want to have an operating business milling your flour? Is this a question you've been asking yourself? It was just like self-evident it'd be like a 4-foot stone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, when I was with Cliff, his is 32 inches stones. And I always I learned from others and asked him, well, what would you, I'm building a mill too, what would you do differently? And he said, oh, well, I'd build it bigger. And I was like, oh, okay, that sounds like a good idea. But he's, 10 years further down with a very well-established business in another city. And so you'd build it bigger so you can have higher volumes. And so I built originally a 4-foot stone mill, and it's like giant. They're really big. Like for my small little bakery, it was way, way too big. And I started with only one person. As I was incorporating staff, it was this really dangerous, super large piece of equipment that was fine if it's just me. And so I thought, oh, I'll just build another one that's smaller. And that one is sitting, and it's a very expensive showpiece that doesn't actually work yet, because I keep running into troubles of, you know, hiccups and time of opening other businesses and what have you. And so I'm actually using a mill from, a 2-foot stone mill from Paul at Slow Rise Bakery. When he upgraded to New American, I got his old mill. So I'm not actually using the mill. I just want to let people know that I built myself. The stones are sitting in a offsite, and yeah.
We've probably reached a point where now you can get a mill built for you by professionals. Andrew's mills, or people are getting mills from other builders. What's the pros and cons of milling on location, Blair? Because you like freshly milled flour and baking, you don't necessarily have to build your mill. So how do you go on choosing whether you're going to build it or find your fresh flour from somewhere else? What's the pros and the cons?
Yeah, so I guess that kind of also ties into your question before too with sizing the mill, is that for us, our mill is a 36-inch stones. We kind of set on that number based on the size and scale of our production. So we knew that we wanted to mill 100% of our flour at our bakery, and so we kind of set on that size based on what we built our mill in a garage essentially, and we knew that we wanted, like I said, to be using only flour that we were milling ourselves because we weren't able to get it anywhere else in Vermont at the time. And so whenever I think about sizing of mills incorporating into your businesses, there's smaller mills are great for doing just whole grain runs, for specialty grains and whole grain runs, and larger mills for larger production. The way mills work is it's 2 stones, it rubs together, squishes the grain. This is the very short thing. But it causes friction and heat, and you want your flour to be cool. And so as you're running your mill, and for the length of time that you're running your mill, you want to take that size into consideration for preservation of the quality of the flour. So when I think about incorporating it into businesses and how you're doing that, I really kind of think about how much you want to be using it, and what percentage you want in all of your breads. We do 1,400 to 1,500 loaves of bread a week. We mill everything. We mill every day. We use it. We choose to mill it the day before we put it into the mixing bowl. There is nothing that quite compares to the aroma of flour as it comes off the stones. And I became addicted to that aroma personally. And so that's how we chose to do that. And then your second question, sorry, if you...
I have a very specific question about the sort of mill that you're going to use. I watched, on Bryn's website, you can see the stones, the lands and the furrows built on it, and I've seen those of Andrew's. And there is the Moulin Astrier in France, who have a different type of lands and furrows. Those are the carvings in the stone, which will become the trajectory of the grain through the mill. Some of the mills are designed to have a very long trajectory, so you can actually mill all grains into all flours and have a very good extraction rate and small bran out of it. And others will be rather quick to eject the flour out of it. Is that something that's important, when you choose the sort of mill to be to look closely at what sort of end result sort of flour you'll get? Moulin Astrier is designed to have very, very small bran out of it, and some others will have very big flakes out of your mills. So is it a question that is good to ask before you build your mill?
Massive,
that's a giant.
It's a massive question.
Why is it important, and how do you go on solving it?
Yeah, I mean, our mill is designed, we sift our grain, so we have a sifter that goes off. We mill whole grain, that being said, on our mill as well. So the way our furrows are set up is so that it shears off the bran large, so we get high extraction, really fine flour. But we also mill a ton of whole grains on it that has that large bran in it. And I've just spent my time figuring out how to work with that flour and be able to make whole grain breads with that large bran flake in there that still has the qualities that I'm looking for, the open structure, the nice airy crumb and a good crust. And
on it.
so it's a big question.
And I think that's one of the, it might sound like, I forget what the original title of this talk was going to be, but it was not necessarily as positively framed, and it was something around the challenges of and
Rewards of baking bread with fresh milk.
yeah,
flour.
and so but there are many great rewards, but it does take a lot of work too of figuring out how to take. So what meal do you choose based on availability, price point, your space, what you can fit in there, then what type of flour is coming off of that mill, and then the grain that's going into the mill, and then from the flour, then how do you then incorporate that into what sort of products you're then selling, because you do in the end have to sell things. And so it's a lot of different variables that you have to be comfortable and excited by and have the energy for playing with. And I've found, tying it back to that business, how to incorporate it into your business is our mill is really visible to customers. And so customers, when they walk in, we have a small retail pickup spot. Customers see it, and I do sort of tours with folks at times. And for me, I've gotten so comfortable with the mill that it's like, oh yeah, we just, a farmer will drop off a bag of grain, and they're like, hey, do you want to buy grain? And I'm like, oh no, I'll check it out. And it's just sort of a routine that we do. But for people that don't even know what a mill is, it's like a great story, that you can tie into your business, that people really connect with. Anytime I've told people about and share my excitement about what we're doing, they, will buy a loaf of bread, and then they come back and,
It's amazing how
it
many
makes a lot of sense to people.
Yeah, and it's amazing how many people don't understand how it's made. And so for these retail bakeries such as yours that has the visibility and use it as an education point to let your customers know why this bread perhaps is a bit more expensive, or why does it have a single grain variety name on it, or why are you taking up all of this retail space on your packaging, talking about the farm that it's coming from. It is an opportunity, a direct opportunity for us as bakers to share that knowledge with our customers who, on very large scale, don't even understand how that flour is produced.
And the mill is the edge between the farmer producer and the baker to consumer. And so knowing how to use whatever mill you are using is that how you make that connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we go to questions about the market and the customers of these breads, as far as working in the lab, what are the issues and the challenges to turn your production line from bags of flour that came from somewhere with grain you don't really know about to having ton bags of grains and milling it yourself and troubleshooting then the whole line up to the loaf? So what were the core issues that you have to solve, and what solutions did you find?
Space.
Space grain storage is like a big thing, like you have to be able to, as you're a small bakery with a regular door, and then you have to, like whenever a farmer brings grain, we're like carrying bags of grain in, I guess which is just like flour, but it's somehow you want to store more grain so that they don't have to come in from the farm as much. I'd say we do use organic white flour, and sometimes it's not communicated from the mill where we get it when things like one time the average protein content dropped and the moisture was way off, and so our bread for like 3 weeks was like thrown off, so it's not just that like everything's perfect from giant huge mills either. And so you have to be dynamic in your team of bakers. Whoever's using the flour, wherever it's from, has to have the ability to sense change and adapt. And so when you're incorporating more whole grain, like all of our products, pastry or bread, are at minimum 30% whole grain. and a majority of them are 100%. And so our bakers on our team have learned that it just changes. So sometimes you have to, if we're trying out a new grain, we have to, temperature and the fermentation in whole grain is like wild, like it really goes quite a lot faster. So sourdough is then sometimes easier, but then it's also complicated because the protein degrades. So you just have to be really flexible, to be able to get it in there.
Does it mean a change into your equipment? Working with a cold room was something you were doing before milling your flour fresh, and that's something you keep doing? Or?
No, we've always retarded all of our doughs. So we use a walk-in to control them, whether they're shaped and being shaped and proofed on couche and in banneton, or if they're being proofed in bulk. So that really gives us an edge in being able to formulate or to keep those doughs under control. It's very true working with fresh milled flour. It's a lot more active. There's 3 things that we noticed immediately right out of the gate. Is it was more active, we were going to have to change our fermentation schedule, and it also was a lot thirstier. So we knew that we needed to be able to hydrate our doughs better, be able to put more water into them. And we immediately noticed that. So we had to kind of keep those in mind and alter our schedules. But that was the challenge that I was looking for as this, it's kind of, baking is repetitive. And so I really needed that kind of analytical side to it. One of the nice things about working with the farms, working with a year's harvest, is we get that crop of Redeemer comes in, we get the grain sent off to the University of Vermont or Cornell, it gets tested, we get numbers back, we get the dawn, we get the falling number, we get the protein, and we continue to get it tested. Our farmers test it multiple times throughout the year as they pull the grain from their bins and from different areas of storage, because it will change, or different parts of the field. So it will change. So we're kind of getting a regular stream of information from our farmers, which also creates and keeps that really solid dialogue going between us, which is the best. And then the next thing after that is, once we've kind of dialed it in, we test it slowly. This year's harvest of a variety of Redeemer, that happens to be a variety of grain that grows really well in Vermont. Once we kind of figure that out, we test it, we get our fermentation schedules down. I can sit with the confidence that until next year's harvest, I have a consistent grain. And I have figured it out. Like this year with our Redeemer, the falling number was really, really, really low. And it was almost not bakeable. And it was extraordinarily challenging to figure out how to use this grain. I was committed to using this grain from the farmer. The protein was great. The flavor was amazing. It just was, the falling number was terrible. So really tweaking it. But once I got my formula down, now I knew that for the next, however many months, as long as I stuck to that, this particular single variety grain loaf of bread would be consistent. And of course, it's going to change this year. The farmer is, again, planting the same variety of grain, but it's on a different field. And so that's part of it.
But then you have that process, then you have that procedure, and you just repeat that. And
you keep that procedure, you keep that consistency, like any part of your production schedule, to have a consistent product in your bakery.
Yeah. Brent, are you also relying on numbers and lab tests for the flours you're getting, the grain you're getting?
We do get the numbers from folks. We don't do the testing throughout the year, but then it's kind of just, I'm stubbornly committed to buying the grain from the people I'm
so
buying. So
how a real turn?
And so
you're the insurance against loss to those farmers.
Yeah. So we find ways to use it. Sometimes.
Totally.
I'm trying to think of a good example, but there's other ways than just also bread to use grain in a bakery. Like all of our we sell these brownies that people really like, and they're 100% rye. So they're 100% rye flour in our brownies. Customers, it's on the label, and I don't know if people really care about it, but it's like an avenue to just use more rye flour. Or all of our pâte sucrée is spelt flour, so it's 100% spelt flour. So it has a really nice nutty taste, and it's not, again, we are not a big bakery, and I really want to it would be different if you're doing, you know, thousands and thousands of loaves and you have wholesale clients and stuff. We're a small space, and so that's our privilege that we're able to play around with that and experiment, and people really kind of like it. Like 100% buckwheat tart shell is like, once you can figure it out, is like awesome. Like, it goes chocolate, nuts, everything. Like, it's really good. Like,
Yeah.
and buckwheat's a kind of weird thing that.
And that's like our, like this one, this harvest from this one particular farm this year with the really terrible falling number is we just do breads, hearth breads. We don't do pastry or anything else. But in light of this obstacle this year, which was one of the first years that we had a potentially, you know, poor, you know, the farmer was just, Nate, his head was in his hand. He's like, what am I going to do with this? I was like, I'll make crackers. Never made crackers before, but I'm going to figure out how to use it, you know. Everything else about it was great. And if I can't ferment it into the style of breads I want, then I'm going to be flexible in my business model and be able to figure out how to do this. And I didn't have to this year, but I'm open and ready for that because of this commitment and partnership that that we're working with, you know.
Yeah.
Like last year, we, in that same commitment way, like last year when Farmer May was talking about the is it 20 for 20 thing in California, where they're trying to push farmers markets to have 20% whole grain. I went back immediately and we were like, okay, what are all the things that we make, and let's jump it to 30. And so like we weren't doing whole grain in our brioche because had this like brioche is sacred or challah. We weren't doing the whole grain, and then we just immediately changed it. And with things like einkorn and spelt, customers don't necessarily notice it's really great, but they don't get turned off by it. It's not a negative, you know.
Yeah, that'd be my last question before we turn to the audience for questions, is the transition to using more of these grains that you mill yourself. Is it something you need to make known to the customers because you're rising the price of what you sell? Or how do you get the customers buy-in? Do you actually try to set up your old business around that model, or you slowly like have like 10% of your production that's you know, grain, freshly milled? There are probably a lot of models for that. How did you integrated that into your model?
We started with it, you know, going, 100%. And it was part of our story. And honestly, our bread has gotten better. So our customers are like excited about that, because I can remember when we first started, I didn't really know what I was doing. And so sometimes loaves of bread like sucked, like were just not good. And I'd give them to customers and be like, oh, make some croutons, or do, you know, and then those were opportunities to share that challenge and success with the customers that then, because those repeat customers are then not being, you know, they're just excited about the same thing. They're like, oh yeah, the bread didn't turn out that great today, you know, or that's how it is. So that's, for me, it was just, we were all in from the start.
And Blair, you had a transition model which turned around the arrival of your son, right? And how did that translate it for the customers?
Translate it for our customers. Well, we knew, I guess the way that we incorporated it and translated it to our customers is we knew that we wanted to be using, the end goal was to be using 100% organic Vermont grain, purchased and working directly with the farmers. And part of that too was to be able, as you said, I wanted to have that story go to our customers. They knew about the bakery. We live in a small community, but it was really mostly about co-branding with the farmers. The farming agricultural scenario in Vermont is very challenged in the last several years. Like so many places, our dairies, we're a very ag-heavy state, and our dairy system is struggling. And so a lot of these farmers, there's a lot of farmers, young farmers, people who grew up in the state moving back to Vermont, wanting to be able to work these agricultural lands and also be able to help diversify the struggling dairy farms and kind of bring their parents and their grandparents' farms back into viable businesses. And by planting organic grains and adding grains into their rotations, and into their grazing, part of their grazing program, and diversifying these farms, these young people were trying to do to make this happen and to revive these and not let these agricultural spaces go fallow. So working with these young farmers, it was really important for us to co-brand and to work with them to promote these young businesses too. And so like on all of our bags, we note where the farm is, who the farmers are, what our relationship is, how many miles away it is, and really trying to work together to bring that awareness to our customers. And what I'm seeing is that by incorporating that into our production and putting that packaging and that information out there, it's changing the vernacular of baked goods, not only in our in like the bread world, but in the restaurants, in the coffee shops, and people are beginning to expect that. So now we're seeing more and more chefs and bakers and restaurants, and people are just asking, like, oh, how far away is this grain coming from? And you know, like, well, I don't know. Like, is this, you know, is this King Arthur flour, or is this locally grown flour, or what is this? And people are actually starting to have those questions. And by kind of creating that need and that momentum, we're seeing more and more demand. And so what that's doing is it's giving the confidence to the local farmers to be able to add these into their production. So we're seeing a revival of our local grain economy, more and more bakeries using fresh milled flour, and also looking to source flour from the regional mills as well, if
We'll
they don't
leave
want to
that
be
to Amber.
crazy like
She's-
100%.
She'll be talking about it in a few minutes from now.
Exactly. And so what I'm seeing is that whether you want to be milling it 100% on site like we're doing, totally not necessary. If you want to just be milling your whole grains and being able to work with your regional mills and your local mills, like that is creating that awareness. And by bakers being willing to kind of take that leap and test their breads and let them be a little weird for a while. And it's an opportunity to communicate with your customers. Like, how come this bread is different? Like, the first time we put that country bread with 100% fresh milled flour, a local guy who had been buying our bread since we started, a guy I knew since I was a kid, called and left a message on our answering machine, and he was like, hey Blair, I love the country bread, but it tastes too much like wheat. Like there's something going on, it's too dark. And I was like, oh, I'm really sorry. Let me explain to you what's going on. Let him know that we were using fresh milled flour, that the bread was a little bit different, and we were still kind of working on it. But it gave me an opportunity to have a direct conversation with our customers. But I hung up the phone, and I was like, yes, like this is the greatest compliment you could possibly have. Instead of him being like, oh, this just tastes, no one's gonna call and be like, wow, this tastes really well fermented. Like to have him call and be like, this tastes more like grain than what I had experienced in your products before. I was like, oh, great, this is perfect. We're doing the right thing. And that's just one example. And that was in the first, that was like the first 2 weeks we were using the fresh milled flour. And so it opens an avenue for dialogue with your customers too.
That's great.
Why is the bread different? Why is it darker? Why
Yes.
maybe does it have it? Why was it tasting this way last month and now it tastes this way? Well, because it was harvest time and we're into now the 2020 harvest. And so the flavor is different. And so guess what? That's how it should taste.
Yeah.
That's how bread should taste.
A really quick anecdote
really
on
quick,
that
we'll
is,
turn to the audience.
our baguettes we use, there's 20% rye flour in it, and our farmer that we get the rye from, 1 week he was unable to bring the flour in because he was busy with other things, or the grain in because he was busy with other things, so we just switched that 20% to einkorn because we had a bunch around. And then we had like 4 customers that were like, oh, what's going on with the baguettes? They tasted different. And then we were able to, it was just in exactly the same way, like exciting to then be like, one, they noticed, because it's just flour, and it's 20%, so how would they clue in on that? And then two, it's that point of conversation that you're able to have with people.
As we see the conversation with the farmers, with even the seed breeders, and we'll see later with the whole network of people willing to make a change is really important. And now let's have the conversation with you guys, and boys and girls, bakers and millers who have questions for our 2 guests here. This is your time. Please come up to the mic. Yes, Brady. Turn on the phone.
Is this on?
The phone. What's the mic? Oh, it's on.
Okay. I have a question about the importance of the temperature of the flour when it comes out of the mill. I have a small home mill. The manufacturers say that the flour can go up to 55, 60 degrees Celsius with no impact on its baking abilities. So what's your take on that question? Like, is it important that the temperature comes out at a certain temperature, and is it going to affect the baking?
I don't know a lot about that science-wise. So all that I can speak to is my anecdotal thoughts. And there is a mill in Saskatchewan that is great in putting out a lot of flour, but it's a hammer mill, and it's really, they spin really fast and bash up the flour. And I like can't make bread with it. It's like incredibly challenging to make bread with it. And I have always associated that with that mill produces a flour that I have a challenge with. And so our mill, as we're milling, we just kind of feel the flour that's coming out, and when it gets warm, we stop. And that's all that we do. I don't.
He tends on the cool side of things.
Yeah,
and
we
Blair.
don't have like temperature gauges or anything.
Yeah, similar. So we run our mill house is not heated. So when it's negative 20 degrees in Vermont, that's the temperature that is going on in our mill. Our goal is to have our flour be kept as cool as possible, 110 degrees and below. Whenever during the hottest times of summer, if the flour is temping warmer, we will give the mill a break, because it is, again, two stones rubbing together and creating friction. And so we control our temperatures that way. There's a thermometer? We temp it. There is a lot of science and studies going on right now. We're in communication regularly with, I'm going to totally blank on his name, Andrew Ross at Oregon State University. And what's trying to happen is to kind of test come up with hard science about those numbers. Because like Bryn said, a lot of it for us as bakers, it is a lot like what works and what doesn't work. And so much like the tradition of stone milling, it is based on your specific area. Like, are you milling in Louisiana and your ambient temperature is, in your space where you're doing it is really, really hot? Are you milling in a warmer climate? Do you need to refrigerate your grains? Right. And what are your grains, and what is the moisture content, and how are they running through the mill, and what kind of friction is happening? And so there's all of these such specific and anecdotal pieces that go into stone milling, right, that are so site and specific to your mill and your region and your locale that, right, it's hard to. There is not a lot of hard science on that. But there are a lot of resources out there, more.
And it's also a question that's good to put out to Amber Lamb from
I was going to say Amber and Andrew.
An interesting thing is to see also, well, your question answers that need for a feeling for what you guys are doing as artisan bakers, and that's part of the story too. What feels right when you're milling your flour and you're touching it. If it doesn't feel right, maybe then it sort of impedes your process anyway. So
heating it up is going to change the activity of your dough. With the flour that's coming off warmer.
And maybe Stephanie from La Milanaise will have answers to that too from another perspective. Yeah, thanks. One last question? Yeah, okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hey, my name's Jess. I'm a baker and bakery owner from Ottawa. First, I just want to say I really commend you guys for being open to having those conversations with your customers about product inconsistency and fluctuations and stuff, because I can relate that that's not always like the easiest thing to explain to people why things are different all the time. My question, I guess my question for you guys is, I'm trying to wrap my head around the profitability of what it is that you're doing. So like the baker in me is super jazzed about what you guys are doing, and then the business owner in me is like, that sounds like so much work. Instead of just receiving bags of flour and turning it into bread, you're receiving grains, milling, and then turning into bread. So I wonder if you could, if it's not too personal of a question, speak a little bit to how do you make how do you make it work from a cost perspective? Like, my labor costs are really high because I'm making a high quality product, and it sounds like that's what you guys are doing too, but you're adding another layer of labor. So is it because the grains you're buying are really cheap, or like how have you mitigated that? Are you asking your customers to pay a premium? I'm just wondering if you could speak to how you manage that.
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
Yes, that's
very good question.
Super good question. So again, I started with the milling, so I didn't have to change anything. So it was just sort of built into how we started out. We, from the money business side of things, I don't know what it is about Saskatchewan, but like organic flour is like just stupidly expensive. So if I was committing as a business to use organic flour, it's very expensive. Like the Saskatchewan milled white organic flour in Saskatchewan is $48 for a 20 kilo bag. So that's like really expensive. Is that the same as it is here? I don't know. Higher, lower? Or?
And we're talking Canadian money here,
Yeah.
because some people here are from the States.
It's higher here? Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. So milling my own flour is cheaper for me because I buy grain at a lower, at like quite a bit lower than that. I, as a teen in Saskatchewan, would drive grain truck for farmers, and these are organic farming friends. And so I'd see when I'm driving, your harvest is happening and you're driving the truck and the combine's unloading, then you drive the truck back to the yard to dump into the auger to go up to the bin. And it's like, as I did it as an adult, I'd be like, that's how many loaves of bread, like it's just like farms in Saskatchewan produce like huge amounts of grain. And so my new, the business smart side of me is thinking, if I can commit to purchasing larger amounts, because the farmers aren't making money when they sell those large amounts to the commodity market, because like even the organic commodity market, there's just a price that it is, and then they sell it. And so there's this huge gap in the middle of where I can benefit from a much lower cost, even from what I'm paying now, if I could find out logistically some way to like store the grain, commit to the grain, something, and even from what the price, like I'm buying grain in bags right now, and then so it'd be much even less. And so even all my excitement, passionate side aside, it does make business sense because on that volume you're purchasing, you save money. Yeah.
And Blair, do you have an answer on the other side of that continuum, which is also creating the value with the customers?
Yeah. So kind of the way that we make it into a viable model for us at our bakery is, first I need you to know that we're a wholesale bakery. We don't have a retail space. We have created systems within our bakery to keep our labor costs low. So our production facility and the way we run our schedule is we make a large amount of bread with very few people just by creating flow systems and to be able to produce what we need with low labor costs within the bakery. The other thing is that, so that's very important. And what having that financial flexibility allows us to do is it gives us more flexibility to pay our farmers more. So initially, whenever we start these partnerships with our farmers, our grain costs, we will pay them for organic grain, very, very good price for their grain. And then the way we've kind of seen it benefit us as a business as the years have gone on, as our relationships have strengthened and they've seen that this is a working relationship that is mutually beneficial. They are, after the first year of us buying 100% of what they grew and just figuring out how to make it work, they were able to have the confidence to get to rent more land and put more grain in the ground. And then the next year they were able to buy a dryer or a new dryer, and so the quality of the grain was better. We were happier. We were able to use it quicker because we were able to use higher percentages of all that grain. So we're seeing the farmers buy our initial investment by choosing to keep our overhead low in our bakery. and to be able to pass that on to them gives them the investment to increase their crops and increase their infrastructure to do higher quality grains. We're using higher percentages, moving through it faster, and as the years go on, we're seeing our investment return by being able, by them, through that confidence, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. What's that?
Have more grain available.
Yeah, exactly. Is by having, okay, so the viability of it is growing, our relationship is strengthened, and then we're able to do is they're increasing their yields, and so they're dropping the price for us slightly after all of those years. But they're also producing more grain and are being able to have access to that. And so, but also going back to cost of breads, quality food should also cost money. Our breads aren't extremely expensive, but we make sure we're just conscious of pricing them to cover our labor costs and to cover our grain costs and the labor that goes into the mills. And it's really nice in our mill, it's easy to use, so we're able to it's not that much work for us. We can mill 3 hours of grain at a time, and be able to just walk away from it. And so there's not a lot of labor that goes into the milling process. Like like I mentioned, we have our systems set up, so we don't have a person sitting there and, watching the mill throughout the day. I can fill the grain with, or the hopper with 300 pounds of wheat and go back to mixing and be milling while I'm mixing. So that helps too.
Yeah, being an artisan also means knowing how to build your systems. And there's some people around here. I'm looking at Melissa, who's coming up with a self-serve approach to how you sell your bread, so she doesn't have to be there.
Yes,
And
totally.
building networks is really part of the equation. Gabrielle, what you guys are doing at the co-op is really important to get that conversation between the bakers and the farmers, so that everyone can improve their processes along the line and make better grains for better flour for better bread. Thanks for joining today. I think people are hungry right now. We're all looking forward to eating that great grain and bread. Thank you very much. Thank you for being there.